So let's talk a little bit about your book,
Yes.
which is called Thief in Law. Tell me how you came to write it, and what came to write the book, which, as we say, is all about the Russian mafia, and what your qualifications are for writing the book.
Certainly. So I was a UK police officer for 11 years. I joined the police in 2003. Before I joined the UK police, I was a student in Russia. I can speak fluent Russian, and I lived in St. Petersburg and Rostov-on-Don. So I had this Russian connection. I had Russian friends. While serving as a police officer, I used to get to do odd jobs using my Russian language. And then when we had the EU expansion eastwards, it started to become almost a daily thing. I would deal with Lithuanian or Russian-speaking criminals. And in 2010, I got to go and work with the Russian police for a month in St. Petersburg. And while there, they started teaching me about the tattoos that these guys wear.
Yeah, because the book is there are lots of illustrations of the tattoos. Why are tattoos such a it surprised me that when I read about the mafia that the tattoos was such an important part of the way they operate.
Yeah, it's all part of the Russian mafia culture. It's like a language of tattoos, and it really distinguishes them. Basically, once they're in prison, they start to heavily tattoo themselves. It all goes back to Stalin's time in the 1920s and 30s, and it was a way to show their opposition to the Soviet government. It was one of the few, inside the Gulag, in Soviet prisons, was one of the few places you could show your opposition to the Soviet power, Sovietsky vlast, and tattooing was part of that. So it grew organically from there. When you had the war, about half the prisoners volunteered to go and fight against the Germans, half stayed. The ones who stayed felt they'd been betrayed by the ones who went, so they started to tattoo themselves more to show that they'd stayed.
How do you mean they felt betrayed? Because they were on the side of Hitler, is that?
Well, they weren't on the side of Hitler. They were on the side of, they were anti-government, and they felt that anyone who'd gone and joined the Red Army was working alongside the Soviet government.
All right.
So they felt these guys had betrayed the criminal classes, and they started to tattoo themselves more. And that's where the language came from. And basically, you can, within Russian prisons, they tattoo themselves to show their crimes they've committed, where they're from, their standing in the criminal world. And the Russian cops taught me you can look at a criminal and you can read his body, and he's like a CV, and you can know who a criminal is, what he's done, his levels, all by reading his tattoos. And it's a very, very important tool for police.
Yes. So tell me, just let me into some of the language of the tattoos, because they're really hardcore, aren't they? I mean, and tattooing yourself in prison is not an easy operation. I mean, am I right in saying that urine is used in some? You're
right, Martin. Yeah, it's quite unpleasant how they do it. Obviously, they don't have the right instrument, so they use a motor from maybe a cassette player or a razor, guitar wire if they've got it, and they create the ink by burning the undersole of their boot and mixing it with urine. They filter that for a sheet. If they can get, some of the guys have told me recently, I only just found this out, that if you can get hold of a makeup, mascara is good.
Yeah.
And they mix the mascara with the urine and soot, and that creates the ink, and it comes out as a sort of bluey greeny colour when it's injected. And you can see these tattoos, they're very poor quality. You know, they're very, obviously due to the lack of instruments and the places they're done. So that's how they're created. And I can give you an example of a guy.
Yeah,
this is the one I always like to tell people. So after I spent my month with the Russian police, I came back to the UK, do my normal duties, and I get a call, Waltham Cross on the M25 up in Hertfordshire. A Latvian guy, covered himself in petrol, and he's going to set himself on fire. He's shouting in Russian. So I get called down. His missus has chucked him out, and he's distraught and he's suicidal, and basically talk him down. We take him away after some time.
And you're brought into this because of your knowledge of Russian?
Yes, because I can speak Russian, and they guessed the guy was Russian. So, and we got quite a large Lithuanian and Russian-speaking community in Hertfordshire, and so I'm speaking to him. Obviously, his clothes are covered in petrol, so we take his clothes off to change them, and I see he's got all the criminal tattoos. So I'm, this is really exciting for me. So what's this one? And he's happily to tell me all about them. He did want a cigarette before he'd tell me, and obviously for certain reasons we couldn't give him a cigarette. But after we hosed him down, he had as many cigarettes as he wanted, and he pointed out all his tattoos, and he had one, a cat's head with keys underneath, and that means a burglar.
Right.
And he told me that back in Latvia and the Baltics, and he was a prolific burglar, and he'd committed 100+ burglaries. Blimey, that's interesting. He also had barbed wire going around his neck, and each spike of barbed wire, basically barbed wire is for a life sentence. And he told me that he'd killed 2 people. One in was either Lithuania or Latvia, and one in the Soviet Union when he was a juvenile. So he had a conviction for manslaughter and murder, and was a prolific burglar. I got all that checked out, and it all turned out to be true. Now, this guy, it turned out, was living rough. living in a tent in a park. We've got no intel on him. He's only got a very basic criminal record, a very basic PNC.
How did he end up here?
He came here to work. He came here as, he's legally entitled to be in the UK. He was a Lithuanian or Latvian citizen. I get mixed up. And he's entitled to be here. There's no security checks coming in. But we had a double murderer and a prolific burglar living in our police area. We knew nothing about, and that's how valuable reading these tattoos is.
Yeah, it's like you say, it's like a CV, isn't it?
It's his CV. Well, there are I think it's 3.8 million EU citizens in the UK. Probably more than half of those are from Eastern Europe, and this criminal tattooing is from the Baltics, from Eastern Poland, anywhere in the former Soviet sphere of influence. If they've been in prison there, they will have criminal tattoos.
It's interesting because I can remember some of the footage we saw during the 2010 Euros, the football championships, and we saw a lot of people with tattoos. At the time, we just thought they were heavily tattooed. But when the England fans were set upon in Marseille, I think it was set upon by the Russians.
Yep.
A lot of them did were heavily tattooed.
Yes. So. I've met one of those guys. They are, as well as being prison tattoos, you also get military tattoos. Guys who've served in the special forces will have a scorpion tattoo, and if the scorpion's in crosshairs, that will show he's had served in Chechnya or seen combat. So it's a real telltale sign. Generally, Russian tattoos becoming more popular, but the greeny, bluey, distinctive, aggressive tattooing is reserved for criminals.
Yeah.
So it's if and you saw those guys in Marseille, you'd have run a bit quicker.
Yeah. Well, Mark Bullen is our guest. Mark is the author of a book called Thief in Law, which is all about the Russian mafia, story told really through tattoos. And we'll talk about some more of these tattoos and a little bit more about Russia with Mark after a short break. My guest in the studio this morning is Mark Bullen. Mark is an expert on the Russian mafia and on Russian criminality generally. Former policeman based in Russia for a while, and we were talking about the tattoos. So one of the other, it's sort of kind of a language, the tattoos, isn't it? What's the point of it? Is it to identify themselves to other? I'm just thinking, is it like a sort of Masonic handshake or something to identify themselves to other criminals?
I mean, that's a good way of describing it, Martin. There's no, why they do it is a bit of a bone of contention. They've got this thing called the understandings, which is a sort of code they live by. You could say 10 commandments. And the final and most important commandment, and one that the Russian police exploit incredibly well, is that you can never deny your vor status. They call themselves vor. So the phrase Russian mafia is something the media use, but in police terminology, it's Russian-speaking organised crime. They call themselves the Vordovazakonya, the thieves in law. And their main commandment, you can never deny your vor status, and the tattoos show your vor status. You can't deny yourself, you can't deny your brothers in the mafia. Unlike the Sicilians, who, it's a secret for them, isn't it? It's a secret organisation.
Yeah.
The Russians, it's the opposite. Now, why they do it? So there's the reason it grew in the Soviet times, but one of the reasons I think it's grown is heavily is Russian prisons were incredibly tough places. They still are.
Yeah.
And having this tattoo CV on your body, you go into the prison, you go into your cell,
and you already know that you're a hard man.
You're showing, I'm not someone you can mess with, and I think that's one of the reasons I think it's very popular, and it grew just as a self-defense mechanism, especially in the 1990s when Russia had its serious problems with crime and economics, and the prisons overflowed, and they became the second most populous in the world.
Yeah, and how powerful is the Russian mafia? Within the Russian states.
Well, within Russia, not so much. Right. So the 1990s were their time. Soviet Union collapsed. You had privatization. I talk about this a lot in the book, and there's whole books written on the subject of the 1990s in Russia, the crime. Basically, they privatized everything. I think called shock therapy. The IMF and the American government insisted they privatized everything very quickly. They issued public citizens with vouchers that they could exchange for shares. However, people who earned the average salary in the early 90s was less than $50 a month, and 49% of the country was in poverty. Inflation was at 1,000%. Things were awful. Police were unpaid. It couldn't have been worse. So people just either sold their vouchers for an average of $7, or they invested them into these schemes, these share investment schemes. That every single one of them went bankrupt, turned out to be a farce. Or if you were smart enough to hold on to your vouchers and invest them, they were taken off you at gunpoint by the mafia, by the oligarchs, by the people who became the oligarchs, were basically mafiosi. They They took control of the whole country's state industry and became billionaires overnight.
Yeah.
And that's how these oligarchs were formed.
So all these people who buy big houses in Hampstead Garden suburbs,
Yep.
that's where it came from.
That's where it came from. It came from the 1990s and basically the asset stripping of Russia. You know, we say oligarchs in the UK. They're the mafia. These guys are the smart mafia. He's dead now, so I can talk about him without issue. And there's a great book on Boris Berezovsky, who was Russia's first billionaire, who fled to the UK in 2003 and was granted asylum here.
Why did they come here? Why, you know, because
Yeah.
we were particularly popular with these oligarchs.
Yeah, we were, and we still are. I can tell you some reasons why they came here. Firstly, Russia has got this fascination with the UK. Anyone who was at the World Cup, I spent the summer there and I was working at the World Cup. Russians love the UK. They love our sport, they love our culture, they love music, they just love the place. So that's one of the attractions. We've got a business advantage where we're in the middle between Moscow and New York, so that's another thing. But main reasons they're here, we have never extradited a single Russian criminal. So there's this whole thing, this Novichok, we're demanding the extradition of these two chaps, which, as it's been said on the news, that the Russians won't do it because it's in their constitution. They can't extradite a Russian citizen. But we have never extradited a single Russian criminal. The UK and basically London is full of Russian mafia who've run here to escape prosecution. And anyone, if you like, go on the Interpol website, anyone, and you can search. You can just type in nationality Russian. There are more than 3,000 Russians wanted by Interpol, and a lot of them are here.
Does it worry you shooting your mouth off about these oligarchs and mafia?
It does a bit. So I don't actually live in England, so I'm heading back to America soon. So I keep my head down while I'm here.
Yeah.
But London is the place. And while I was a police officer, you know, I'd privileged information for a lot of it. And a lot of these oligarchs are. Now I'm not a cop. I can say what I like. A lot of these cops work for us. You know, a lot of these oligarchs are in with the British state, and they're helping us. So you'll see, Berezovsky, he's dead now. So he was the main Russian baddie. He had a big court case with Abramovich, and in court he admitted that he called himself Dr. Evil. And one of his enemies would die every 3 days when he was having the metal wars. And he was here. You know, he was wanted by Brazil. He was investigated by Switzerland, and he was wanted for numerous murders and crimes in Russia. We didn't extradite him because he was a billionaire. And the London housing market, before the crash, 60% of houses bought in this city were 60% of houses that cost over 20 million were paid for by Russians.
Yeah. Is that still the case? I mean, we're still awash with Russian oligarchs.
Yeah. You look at that. What's that big building at Hyde Park Corner? I think it's One Hyde Park Corner.
One Hyde Park Corner, yeah. They've just bought there's a penthouse flat.
Yeah, the percentage,
which is the most expensive flat in the UK, isn't it?
I don't know what it is, but it's 40 or 50% of people who've bought that are Russian speaking. So not just Russian nationals, but Ukrainian oligarchs. You know, Kazakhstan. I think it's a Kazakhstan guy, as Boris. But you know, that's Russian money. And if that Russian money was put, and this is why it's very interesting what's going on now. And I don't think it will happen. We won't force the oligarchs out because our housing market will crash.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering what it's like on a personal level, actually living in Russia, because I know you live in the States now, but you have lived in Russia, and you've worked with, I think, is it Zenit St. Petersburg, the football?
I've done some translating for them, and I've spent the whole summer in Russia. I was there from May until last
Well, what's
month.
it like on a personal? My daughter was there covering the World Cup, so you know she told me about some of the dodgy hotels she stayed in, which were well dodgy. I was just wondering, and you were give me a little anecdote about the fact that the post office doesn't work in Russia.
Yeah.
Does it function rather poorly how does the Russian society function?
I first went there in the 90s, and then it was terrible. You could see it was really awful, and you know, for 100, you could live on £100 a month quite easily. Now it's much better. Moscow, St. Petersburg, fantastic cities. Even the regions where they held the World Cup, great. And I went to 8 matches during the World Cup, Moscow, Petersburg.
But did they just do that for the World Cup? Did they,
no, Moscow and St. Petersburg are great. And the regions, there are some poor parts, but it's nowhere near as bad. Honestly, I can tell everyone, go there. It's incredibly safe. That's one of the things. It's an incredibly safe country. I'll give you an example. Police numbers. The United Nations say that each per 100,000 you should have 220 coppers. In the UK, we've got 211. We're under the United Nations minimum. Russia has nearly 600 per 100,000. Other than Belarus, they've got the highest amount of police. And you go over and there are police everywhere. It's incredibly safe. So that's one thing I think people are struck by.
See, I'm amazed you say it's incredibly safe, given that your whole book is about these terrible gangsters.
Well, that's the thing. These terrible gangsters, in the 1990s, they were running riot, and they were in control of the country. And they were so bad that these oligarchs were in the government. They were holding minor positions in the government, and Boris Yeltsin was doing deals with the mafia to stay in power. That's how powerful they were. But in the last decade, in the last 15 years, there's been a huge government fight back against them. The government, I know this is unpopular with British people, but Putin specifically has had a program where he's clawed back the oligarchs' possessions. Before, in the late 90s, the government had 10% of the oil industry. Now, Russia depends totally on oil, oil and gas.
Gazprom, isn't it?
Gazprom, yeah. That's okay. But 10% of the oil industry was in government hands. Now it's over 50%. They're clawing it back from the oligarchs who stole it in the 90s. And that money's being invested into social programs, into the police, into prisons. They've just built the biggest prison in Europe outside St. Petersburg, and it's fantastic. It's a 5-star prison.
See, the view we have of Putin is that he's often called a gangster.
Yeah. It's nonsense. Do you know what? I heard it on the BBC today. They have these so-called experts on saying Putin and the oligarchs. Putin went to war with the oligarchs. The main three oligarchs, well, just the two of the main ones, Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky, the two richest men in Russia. He went to war with them. One of them he caught in a plane on his way to the UK, and he did 15 years and now lives in Switzerland after being let out. And Berezovsky came here. He went to war with the oligarchs, and people say, oh, Putin and cronies and gangsters. It's not true. It's Yeltsin, absolutely. Yeltsin was in the pocket of the oligarchs, and the country was controlled by organised crime. But that's totally changed, and they went to war with the organised crime in the 2000s. And I show in the book a graph of the murder rate, which is a great way of, cops anywhere in the world will tell you can massage figures for burglaries, you can massage robberies, you can't massage murders, it's difficult. The murder rate in Russia, in the Soviet Union, it went 3 times higher by the mid-2000s, by the end of the 90s, when Putin takes over. It was the same as Brazil and Jamaica, the murder rate. Now it's lower than the Soviet Union, and the murder rate in Moscow is the same as New York, 5.5. It's very low. It's New York and Moscow are twice as high as London. Maybe it's a bit different now with all the problems, but it's very safe. It's nothing like it used to be. In the 90s it was terrible, but Putin and the Russian government have gone to war with organised crime and the oligarchs. They've kicked a lot of them out. There is still a problem. They've just elected a new head of the Vordozakonya in Moscow to replace this dead Hassan who died, and then his replacement has just been locked up. So they're still at war with the Vord. But a lot of them have run away, and they're in America, they're in the UK. In the UK, they're not as active as they are in the rest of Europe. Poland is under 20,000 Russian criminals operating in Poland. France, the French Riviera, is controlled by Russian mafia. And I'll give you another good one. Switzerland, 24% of burglaries committed in Switzerland are committed by Russian speakers.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what about Spain? Have they made, because our gangsters like to go to Marbella. Are there Russians there?
There are, and Spain is a great one. I'm quoting now from a report by Walter Kigo, who's the head of the Swedish police, who was tasked by Interpol investigating this. He says the Russian mafia control 90% of the drugs trade in Spain.
Right.
Now and the Spanish drugs trade is one of the most valuable in the world. That is, you're talking billions of dollars.
Now, if people want to hear more about all this, the book, I say, is Thief in Law, so they can get the book. But you're giving some talks in the UK while you're over here.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, so I'm doing a number of some open to the public, some just police only. But I'm in Manchester this Sunday. That's organised by Funzing. If you go if you just Google Funzing, you can find me. I'm in Leicester, I'm in Leighton Buzzard, and then I'm in Cologne. I've just done the London talk. If you go on my website, markgbullen.com, there's the events. You can find the links to get everything. I'm on Twitter, Mark G. Bullen. And I say the book Thief in Law, it's from Schiffer Books in America. It's already in the shops in America now, and in the UK you can order it on Amazon. And it'll be sent to you at the end of the month.
Brilliant. Well, it's a fascinating topic,
thank you,
Mark, and I'm sure people would be interested in hearing you talk about it. Mark Bullen's been our guest. Mark, thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Martin.